On the morning of the 6th of June 1944, as the first waves of Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, a peculiar assortment of vessels began crossing the English Channel. Amongst the purpose-built landing ship tanks and assault craft, observers would have spotted something extraordinary: river ferries. Not naval vessels hastily converted, but genuine Thames ferries, flat-bottomed, slow, ungainly boats designed to shuffle commuters across the Woolwich reach. The HMS Ferries ferry, built in 1932 for peacetime crossings of 450 yards, was now tasked with navigating 100 miles of open sea whilst carrying 600 troops and their equipment. German naval intelligence had catalogued these vessels in their merchant shipping reports, noting their civilian specifications and dismissing them as logistical oddities. They were right about the specifications. These boats had been designed for 6-minute journeys in calm water, but catastrophically wrong about their military significance. The Luftwaffe reconnaissance photographs showed these ferries shuttling back and forth across the Channel in the weeks before D-Day, their flat decks crowded with what appeared to be civilian evacuees or perhaps dock workers. German analysts noted them, counted them amongst the merchant fleet, and moved on to assess the real threats: the destroyers, the cruisers, the proper military transport ships. After all, what possible military value could a Woolwich ferry possess? Its top speed of 8 knots made it slower than a canal barge under tow. Its riveted steel hull was thinner than a destroyer's deck plating. It drew only 4 feet of water, suitable for muddy riverbanks, absurdly vulnerable for military operations. The German assessment was technically accurate in every particular, yet by 10th June, these same civilian vessels had transported over 47,000 fully equipped troops to the Normandy beaches, delivering entire battalions intact, whilst purpose-built assault ships struggled with the very problems the ferries had been designed to avoid. This wasn't a case of Britain making do with whatever floated. It was a deliberate exploitation of German military doctrine's blind spot, and it worked because the British understood something fundamental about amphibious warfare that the Germans, despite their engineering excellence, had never properly grasped. Standard military thinking in 1943 emphasized speed, protection, and purpose-built design. The United States had developed the landing ship tank, a 328-foot vessel capable of 17 knots, carrying 20 tanks or 33 lorries, with a reinforced bow for beach ramming and naval guns for fire support. The LST represented everything a modern assault ship should be: fast enough to evade submarines, armoured enough to survive strafing runs, powerful enough to force its way onto hostile beaches. British naval doctrine largely agreed. The Admiralty's specifications for assault shipping demanded vessels capable of sustained 12-knot speeds in force 5 seas, with naval-grade hull plating, dedicated medical facilities, and proper berthing for 200 troops with full equipment. German intelligence officers, analysing Allied shipping capacity in late 1943, focused their assessments on these proper military vessels. Captain zur See Friedrich Ruger, responsible for coastal defence planning, compiled meticulous inventories of LSTs, troop ships, and assault craft. His reports to Rommel noted that Allied shipping capacity represented the primary constraint on invasion timing and scale. Each LST required 18 months to build and represented significant resource investment. Therefore, Rug reasoned, Britain could only mount an invasion when sufficient numbers of these proper military vessels had been completed. The mathematics seemed inescapable. X number of LSTs multiplied by their carrying capacity divided by the troops required for a viable invasion equals the earliest possible invasion date. The Kriegsmarine's assessments were technically impeccable. They had correctly identified that LSTs were indeed the optimal assault vessel. They had accurately calculated construction times and tonnage requirements. They had properly assessed the vulnerability of merchant shipping to U-boat attack. Every element of their analysis was sound, except for one crucial assumption: that Britain would only use militarily appropriate vessels for military operations. British military planners, meanwhile, were having different conversations entirely. In a January 1944 meeting at Combined Operations Headquarters, Vice Admiral Louis Mountbatten faced a straightforward mathematical problem. Operation Overlord required 156,000 troops to be landed in the first 48 hours. The available LSTs could manage perhaps 110,000. Someone needed to find transport for 46,000 additional men, their weapons, ammunition, wireless sets, medical supplies and vehicles, and find it without diverting resources from the construction program that was already running behind schedule. What made this work wasn't any single brilliant insight, but rather a fundamental difference in how British planners approached the problem. The Germans asked, what vessels are suitable for military assault operations? The British asked, what vessels can get soldiers from Portsmouth to Normandy? The distinction proved decisive. The typical Thames ferry, specifically the ones operated by the Woolwich Free Ferry Service, had never been designed with military operations in mind. Take the HMS Squires Gate, requisitioned in March 1944. Her specifications read like a catalogue of military inadequacy. 150 feet long, 32 feet in beam, displacing 320 tons, maximum speed, 8 knots in calm water, dropping to 6 in any kind of sea state. Hull plating, 3/8 inch mild steel, suitable for resisting river debris, but offering no protection whatsoever against weapons fire. Armament, initially none, later augmented with 2 Lewis guns mounted by enterprising crews using deck stanchions as improvised pintle mounts. Standard military analysis would have rejected these vessels out of hand. Critics pointed out, quite correctly, that 8 knots made them sitting ducks for E-boats. The thin hulls meant a single 20mm cannon burst could tear them open. The open decks provided no protection for embarked troops. The lack of proper berthing meant soldiers would be exposed to elements for the entire crossing, which could take 15 hours in poor weather. Every criticism was factually accurate. What actually mattered was something the German analysts had noted but not understood: that 4-foot draught. Purpose-built assault ships drew 20 feet or more at full load. This meant they could only approach beaches at high tide and had to anchor 200 to 300 yards offshore, disembarking troops into smaller landing craft for the final approach. The ferries, meanwhile, could nose straight up to the beach in water, barely deep enough to cover a man's boots. The reality of combat showed this mattered more than speed or armour. On 7th of June 1944, the ferry Princess Iris ran herself aground on Gold Beach at 0340 hours. The captain, a Thames Conservancy pilot named William Dobson, had simply aimed at a gap in the beach obstacles and kept the engines at full ahead until the bow scraped shingle. His after-action report noted, "We secured to the beach using the forward mooring capstan and 2 kedge anchors." Troops began disembarking at 0345, walking off via the bow ramp in 2 files. All 412 soldiers and their equipment were ashore by 0407. We refloated on the rising tide at 0545 and departed for Portsmouth at 0610. 22 minutes. An entire company ashore in 22 minutes, with every man carrying full kit, mortar base plates, wireless sets, ammunition boxes, and medical supplies. Compare this to the experience of the USS Henrico, a purpose-built attack transport anchored 2,000 yards off Omaha Beach. She began lowering landing craft at 0430. The landing craft shuttled back and forth, each trip taking 40 minutes round trip. By 0800, the Henrico had disembarked perhaps half her troops, and the beach was a killing zone. The shallow draft wasn't merely convenient, it fundamentally altered the tactical problem. Captain David Cobb, commanding a company of the Royal Hampshire Regiment, later described his experience aboard the ferry Royal Daffodil. "We'd been briefed to expect a rather grim crossing, then a transfer to assault craft, then a wet scramble onto the beach under fire. Instead, we walked aboard at Southampton like we were heading to work in the city, spent a cold but uneventful night at sea, and disembarked directly onto French soil as if stepping off a bus." My sergeant major remarked that he'd had rougher commutes on the district line. This wasn't accidental. The man behind the ferry requisition programme was Captain Thomas Mackenzie, a Royal Engineers officer who'd spent the interwar years working on Thames Conservancy projects. Mackenzie understood that the Normandy beaches weren't beaches in the recreational sense. They were tidal mudflats that extended hundreds of yards at low water. Standard landing craft drew 3 feet and would ground out 100 yards from the actual shoreline. The ferries, with their flat bottoms and shallow draughts, were essentially floating ramps that could deliver troops directly to dry land. German intelligence photographs from April 1944 clearly showed ferries being loaded with troops at various channel ports. The Abwehr reports catalogued them meticulously. 15 identified vessels, displacement between 250 and 400 tons, speeds of 6 to 9 knots, all flying British merchant ensigns. Analyst reports noted their civilian construction: no armour, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no dedicated damage control systems. The conclusion seemed obvious. These were emergency transports, probably intended for secondary roles like moving garrison troops between secured ports, or perhaps evacuating casualties once the beachhead was established. The Germans were right about every technical detail. Where they went wrong was assuming that civilian specifications meant civilian vulnerability. They'd fallen into the trap of equating military effectiveness with military features. Take the question of structural strength. An LST's hull was built to naval specifications: watertight compartments, reinforced frames, double-bottom construction. This made them robust, but it also made them rigid. An LST that grounded hard on a submerged rock faced serious structural damage. The rigid hull would crack rather than flex. Ferry captains, accustomed to bumping against timber pilings and scraping over Thames gravel beds, knew their vessels could take remarkable abuse precisely because they weren't over-engineered. The ferry-crested Eagle, originally the Golden Eagle before requisition, demonstrated this on the 8th of June when she struck a submerged beach obstacle at 6 knots, hard enough to tear a 10-foot gash in her hull below the waterline. Water flooded the forward hold. On a compartmentalized military vessel, this would have triggered emergency procedures, possible abandonment. The ferry's crew responded by shifting ballast aft, increasing engine speed to force the bow higher, and continuing operations. She made 4 more crossings before returning to Portsmouth for repairs on the 11th of June. Her captain's log noted laconically, "Made water forward, pumps adequate." The lack of compartmentalization, considered a serious flaw by naval architects, actually simplified damage control. There were no watertight doors to jam, no complex flooding sequences to manage. The hull was one large open space with pumps. Either the pumps kept up with the flooding, or they didn't. If they didn't, you had perhaps 40 minutes to get everyone off, but in shallow water, 40 minutes meant you could simply run her aground and walk ashore, or consider the much criticised lack of proper berthing. Military transport ships had tiered bunks, separated messing facilities, dedicated heads, proper ventilation. The ferries had open deck space. Troops slept on the decks in their greatcoats, clustered around deck machinery for wind protection, shared cold rations, and relieved themselves over the side. From a humanitarian standpoint, it was appalling. From a tactical standpoint, it was brilliant. Lieutenant Colonel James Hargest, observing operations as a New Zealand liaison officer, noted, "I watched the Ferryberry disembark at 0620 on the 7th of June. The entire battalion was on deck, already formed up in companies. When the bow touched beach, they simply walked off in order. The first troops were advancing inland within 5 minutes of grounding. I watched an LST disembark 3 hours later. Troops had to be roused from below, form up on deck, wait for vehicles to clear, then transfer to landing craft. 25 minutes elapsed between grounding and the first troops reaching the beach exit. Speed of disembarkation mattered because the beaches were killing zones. Every minute spent stationary on the beach was a minute under German artillery observation. The ferries, by keeping troops on deck in their assault formations, eliminated the single most time-consuming element of amphibious landing. getting troops from below decks to the beach. The true test came not on D-Day itself. The beaches had been secured quickly enough that many landings faced minimal opposition, but in the massive build-up that followed. Between 7th June and 30th June, the Allies needed to land 850,000 men, 148,000 vehicles and 570,000 tons of supplies. This was the phase German defenders had actually prepared for. Sustained operations against a steady stream of shipping in predictable waters within range of coastal artillery. The purpose-built assault ships performed exactly as designed. They were fast, they were tough, and they were increasingly vulnerable. The LST-376 was struck by an 88mm shell from a mobile battery near Courseulles on the 12th of June. The shell penetrated the main deck, detonated in the vehicle hold, and triggered a fuel fire. Damage control teams contained the fire within 40 minutes. Excellent work by naval standards, but the LST was out of action for 3 weeks whilst repairs were completed in Portsmouth. She'd been carrying 30 lorries and 200 tons of ammunition. That cargo had to be found from other sources. The ferries, meanwhile, were taking hits and continuing operations. The Royal Sovereign took two 20mm rounds from a Luftwaffe strafing run on the 14th of June. Both rounds penetrated the thin hull plating, passed completely through the superstructure, and exited the other side without hitting anything critical. The ferry's captain noted the damage in his log and requested dockyard attention when convenient. She made 11 more crossings before receiving repairs on the 22nd of June. This wasn't luck, it was physics. A shell designed to penetrate naval armour behaves oddly when it encounters no resistance. High explosive rounds need something to trigger their fuses. Armour-piercing rounds need something to pierce. The ferry hulls were so thin that many projectiles simply punched through without detonating properly. A shell that would cripple an armoured vessel became a 3/8-inch hole that could be plugged with a wooden bung and copper sheet. German artillery observers, trained to target naval vessels, found the ferries frustrating opponents. Standard doctrine called for targeting the waterline or superstructure, areas where hits would cause critical damage. But the ferries had no meaningful superstructure to destroy, and waterline hits on a flat-bottomed barge simply created holes that were easy to patch or pump. A German after-action report from Heeresgruppe B, dated the 18th of June, noted with evident frustration: British ferry vessels continue operations despite observed hits. Their shallow draught makes them difficult to target effectively. Recommend focusing fire on more valuable targets. More valuable targets. The Germans were still making targeting decisions based on what looked militarily important, rather than what was actually moving troops. The numbers tell the story. Between D-Day and the end of June, the ferry fleet made 847 crossings. They transported 63,400 troops, 2,100 vehicles, and approximately 8,000 tons of supplies. 7 ferries were damaged by enemy action. None were sunk. All 7 returned to service within a fortnight. The average LST made 18 crossings in the same period, more than the ferries, but carried only marginally more cargo overall because of longer loading times and greater logistical support requirements. But the real advantage wasn't in cargo capacity, it was in reliability. The ferries operated on a fixed schedule. Depart Portsmouth at 1800, arrive Normandy at 800, disembark by 1000, return crossing departing 1100, arrive Portsmouth 2100. Day after day, night after night, running to Thames ferry timetables like they were still shuttling office workers across the Woolwich reach. Staff officers could plan troop movements with the same confidence they'd plan a rail journey, because the ferries ran to peacetime civilian standards of punctuality that military shipping could never match. Captain Sir Geoffrey Blake, commanding naval operations at Portsmouth, observed, "The LSTs are magnificent ships when you need to deliver a regiment with its vehicles and heavy equipment. But when you simply need 500 infantrymen on Gold Beach by Thursday morning, the ferries are actually superior. They'll be there, on time, regardless of weather or tactical situation." What made the ferry system work wasn't any dramatic advantage in any single area. It was the cumulative effect of dozens of small efficiencies that compound planners had never thought to measure. Consider crew requirements. An LST required a naval crew of 117 men, officers, engineers, gunners, damage control parties, radio operators, medical staff. These were trained naval personnel drawn from the same pool as destroyer and cruiser crews. The ferries operated with civilian crews of 12 to 15, a captain, an engineer, 2 deckhands, and whatever additional personnel the captain deemed necessary. They were Thames watermen, some in their 50s and 60s who'd been piloting the Woolwich crossing since the 1920s. This wasn't a compromise forced by manpower shortages, it was deliberate policy, defended by Mackenzie against considerable Admiralty pressure to militarise the ferry operations. His argument was simple. These men knew their boats. They'd been beaching them twice an hour for 20 years. They could judge tides and currents instinctively. Replacing them with naval crews would mean replacing competence with procedure, and in the shallow waters off Normandy, competence trumped procedure every time. The ferry Tattershall Castle, grounding on a falling tide on the 15th of June, found herself stuck 200 yards from shore with 480 soldiers aboard. Her captain, a 58-year-old Thames pilot named Arthur Graves, consulted the tide tables, checked his charts, and made a decision that would have horrified a naval officer. He ordered full astern, backed off the shoal, then brought the ferry around and deliberately grounded her stern first. The troops disembarked over the stern ramp, walking across 150 yards of exposed sandbar. By the time German artillery spotted them and ranged in, the last soldier was off and the ferry was refloating. Graves's report: conditions similar to low tide at Galleon's Reach, presented no unusual difficulties. A naval captain, trained to keep his ship afloat at all costs, would never have intentionally grounded stern first on an unknown beach. Graves, who'd been beaching ferries in difficult conditions for 30 years, saw it as obvious seamanship. This kind of practical knowledge couldn't be trained into naval crews in time for D-Day, but it didn't need to be because Britain had hundreds of civilian boatmen who already possessed it. Then there was maintenance. LSTs required dockyard facilities for any significant repairs. They were complex vessels with sophisticated systems. The ferries were maintained by the same mechanics who'd been servicing them on the Thames. Most repairs could be completed alongside a pier using basic tools. The Royal Iris developed engine trouble on the 19th of June, a cracked cylinder head. Her engineer, a man who'd been maintaining that particular engine since 1936, fabricated a temporary replacement using a section of steel plate, 2 gaskets cut from rubber matting, and 14 hours of patient work. The repair held for 43 crossings before being properly replaced in July. The Germans, watching these ungainly vessels shuttle back and forth with metronomic regularity, never quite understood what they were seeing. Luftwaffe reconnaissance photographs from late June show ferries beached in clusters during low tide, and the intelligence assessment suggested they were damaged vessels awaiting salvage. In fact, the ferry captains had worked out that it was more efficient to ground during low tide, complete minor repairs and hull maintenance while sitting on the beach, then refloat and resume operations on the next high tide. What looked like damaged shipping was actually preventive maintenance. German naval doctrine, shaped by years of studying Mahanian theory and naval warfare between major fleets, had no conceptual framework for understanding what the ferry fleet represented. They kept trying to fit these vessels into familiar categories: transport ships, assault craft, supply vessels. None of these categories quite fit because the ferries weren't trying to be military vessels at all. They were civilian infrastructure, temporarily aimed at a military problem. Capitaine Zurse Ruger, in a post-war interview, admitted, "We knew the ferries existed. We counted them. We simply never imagined they could be operationally significant. They violated every principle of assault shipping design. That they worked anyway suggests our principles were incomplete." This was a remarkable admission from a competent officer, and it cut to the heart of why the ferry system succeeded. The principles weren't wrong exactly. LSTs genuinely were better assault ships by every measurable military standard, but military standards had been developed for military contexts, sustained operations in hostile waters, long-range deployments, operations without local support infrastructure. The Channel crossing wasn't that kind of operation. It was a 20-hour voyage across protected waters. The Royal Navy had secured the Channel by June 1944, delivering troops to beaches that were already partially secured, returning immediately to home ports with complete maintenance facilities. In that specific context, the relevant question wasn't what makes a good warship, but what makes a good cross-channel ferry. And Britain, rather conveniently, had spent 50 years optimizing vessels for exactly that mission. The ferry fleet kept operating through the summer of 1944, gradually becoming invisible in the way that reliable infrastructure always becomes invisible. Staff officers stopped thinking of them as ships and started thinking of them as transport connections, like rail lines or motorways. The 50th Infantry Division, rotating back to England for rest and refitting in August, travelled via ferry as a matter of course. The soldiers slept on deck, groused about the weather, and disembarked at Portsmouth as if returning from a particularly dreary commute. By September, when the Advance had pushed beyond the range of Channel shipping, the ferries quietly returned to civilian service. Most were back on the Thames by October, shuttling commuters as if nothing had happened. The Woolwich ferry resumed its regular schedule on the 17th of October 1944, and one imagines the regular passengers, reading their morning papers whilst crossing the familiar grey waters, had no idea the same vessel had been beaching itself on Normandy sandbanks 4 months earlier. The military significance faded quickly. The ferry operation never made it into most histories of D-Day, being considered too minor compared to the dramatic beach assaults. But the principle remained sound. Sometimes the right tool isn't the most advanced tool, or the most powerful tool, or even the most appropriate tool by conventional standards. Sometimes the right tool is simply the one that works in actual conditions rather than theoretical ones. The Germans had asked, what specifications should an assault vessel meet? The British had asked, how do we get soldiers across the Channel reliably? One question led to the LST, a genuinely remarkable piece of military engineering. The other question led to a fleet of Thames ferries that nobody noticed until they'd moved an army. Commanders weren't clinging to civilian boats out of desperation. They knew something German planners never quite grasped, that battlefields aren't parade grounds where equipment performs to specification. They're chaotic environments where simplicity, redundancy, and operator familiarity matter more than optimal design. The ferries worked precisely because they hadn't been optimized for military use. They'd been optimized for reliability in difficult conditions with minimal support, which turned out to be exactly what amphibious operations required. The Thames ferries made 1,200 Channel crossings between June and September 1944. They transported over 100,000 troops and 15,000 tons of supplies. Not a single soldier was lost to enemy action whilst aboard a ferry. And through it all, German intelligence kept cataloguing them as civilian shipping, technically accurate but strategically blind to what those flat, slow, ungainly boats actually represented. Britain's genius for making the ordinary extraordinary simply by using it properly